Welcome, everybody. Happy August. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are uh, very much nearing the end of our reading together of Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind. We've been reading this wonderful book from the Kritische Gesamtausgabe, the critical collected works of Hannah Arendt. Just came out this year. And it's a new version of The Life of the Mind. And for those of you who are reading the older version, which had been um, edited by Mary McCarthy, there's some differences, but and so you'll start to notice some. There are actually more differences in the willing sections than in the thinking sections. So it's worth getting a copy of this if you can. This is the actual text Arendt wrote, unedited by her editors, and worth our paying attention to. So, just a reminder: the whole book takes part in three parts or three books. One on thinking, one on willing, and one on judging. We read the book on thinking, which was largely done and finished by Arendt. The book on willing is what we're coming close to ending now, and then the book on judgment was never written. The book on willing, which we're in, has 4 chapters. The sort of core middle chapter, which we finished last week, is about what she calls the quaestio me factus sum, a question I have become for myself, the discovery of the inner man. It's about the Christian, largely Christian, discovery of our inner conflict of our will. Why did the Christians discover the will, right? The will, she thinks, is not something that the Greeks or the Romans really paid attention to. And because the problem of the will is the problem of freedom, the Greeks and the Romans, she thinks, also didn't have a concept for freedom and didn't pay attention to freedom. Why did the Christians discover the will? Because they took seriously this fundamental fact that we humans are fallen, that we're sinful, that we can't be who we want to be, right? The Greeks knew that we wanted to be gods. It was obvious to Herodotus, for example, that and Thucydides, that we mortals wanted to be like the immortals, and that we would never be. But they didn't think of that as like a, as something that was profoundly troubling our inner conscience, our inner life. For the Christians, it did, because as Paul said, I will to follow the law, but I cannot. And this inner conflict in the soul of man, that I can't live a Christian life, was fundamental to the Christians. And Paul's idea that I have 2 laws, that I'm under the law of the rational law and the law of my members, really did drive him crazy. And Augustine, who I think for our end is really the great Christian thinker of the will, switches from the 2 laws that Paul talks about to the 2 wills, because to say that there are 2 laws would be a kind of heresy. And so Augustine frames it as the conflict inside of me between the spiritual and carnal wills. I can will or I can will not. I can nil. I can will what is right or I can nil what is wrong. And this conflict inside of me, the question that I have become for myself, am I a Christian or not? Am I a godly being or not? is at the center of the Christian idea of the human experience. And because the Christians were so influential in the development of Western philosophy, um, this question of freedom as an internal struggle gets framed in Western philosophy in this Christian valence, with this Christian valence, right? It's a question of internal freedom. Um, and for our end, the real importance of Augustine, which we read last week, is that he is the first philosopher, the first Christian philosopher, but also the first philosopher who puts the question of the will at the center of the human experience of freedom, or puts the will and thus freedom at the center of the human experience. And for Augustine, in the act of willing, I can start something new. There's a kind of fundamental human freedom. And this natality, as she will call it, this idea that I can give birth to myself and to new ideas through my internal action, is central to the Western idea of freedom. Arendt, as I said last week, values this Augustinian discovery of human freedom as the power to begin. But she also is going to reject this, or at least see the limits of this Christian idea of an internal idea of freedom, because the internal idea of freedom denies or ignores freedom to impact the world, to change the world, the public idea of freedom. Um, uh, and for our end, we need to move beyond thinking about the will and freedom simply as uh, a discovery of the inner man, to bring them out into the world. Okay, so that is largely the focus and the inquiry in chapter 2 of this book on willing. We now today are reading the entirety of chapter 3. Um, uh, it's a short chapter. It's only got 2 sections, one on Thomas Aquinas and the primacy of the intellect, and the other on Duns Scotus and the primacy of the will. Um, why this new chapter? Because what Aquinas and Scotus are doing, right, is on the one hand they're Christians, right? They're even more philosophical than Augustine. They're 13th century Christian monks. They live 1,000 years after Augustine, so we, in a sense, we've skipped 1,000 years of world history in which, in the history of philosophy, not much is said to have happened. Um, uh, and where Augustine wrote from his experiences, he wrote from his experience of wanting a pear and knowing he shouldn't take it. And Paul wrote from his experience of craving to follow the law of his members and yet not wanting to. Um, Aquinas and Duns Scotus don't write from experience. They write as what we call scholastics. They write according to rules, and reason and logic. Um, they ask the intellect for help in order to know and secure faith, or at least Aquinas does. And so they're very highly intellectual scholastic writers, which is why we call them scholastics. Um, I will tell you that in my experience, reading them is painful. Um, uh, if you try to read the Summa Theologica. I've tried to teach parts of it every once in a while. It reads like a primer for elementary school in some way, except on a very advanced level. There's just different topics, and in each topic there's a question in which Aquinas says, here's the question. Then here's a discussion in which he brings out different problems with the question. Then he talks about objections that people raise to the question. Then he says that on the contrary, there are these people who say the opposite of the people who object to these things. And then he gives you his answer. And his answer is supposed to be a rational answer based on reason and authority. There's no rhetoric. There's no persuasion. there's no flourishes. Um, it's supposed to simply teach you to trust in the compelling truth of the rational argument. Um, as is said on page 297 of the text for Arendt, there's a trust in the compelling truth, and to the truth promulgated from without by revelation responded the light of reason from within. Uh, this idea that for Aquinas, truth is given to us by revelation, by God, by grace, but the task of our reason is to understand revelation, and it can mimic it. It can actually say the same thing as revelation. We can get to revelation through reason. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in comparison to Duns Scotus later, but um, those of you who studied philosophy when I did, or even before I did, probably encountered this as the debate between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, right? Um, the Dominicans are those thinkers, philosophers, theologians who believe that reason can lead to truth. And the Franciscans, led by St. Francis, are those who believe that in the end, reason is limited and incapable of truth, and that the only way to attain the truth is through divine revelation. I don't know how often these debates are taught anymore in graduate school or where I learned them, but this was essential. And if you read the text that Arendt is largely relying on here, on medieval Christian philosophy by Etienne Gilson, you'll get up to speed on the Franciscan Dominican debates. By the way, I should say that if you look at the citations here, there's very few, if any, citations to either Duns Scotus or Aquinas. They're almost all citations to secondary sources, mostly Gilson and in Duns Scotus, some others. The point is that, again, these people are very hard to read. They're in a very hermetically sealed theological argument, and Arendt is largely relying here on Gilson and others to do her to understand them. The point, though, is that for Aquinas and for Duns Scotus, right, they're no longer interested in the will itself, as was Augustine. For Augustine, there were, as he said, three mental faculties: memory, intellect, and will. They drop memory out, right? For Arendt, this is a problem because, if you read her work, memory is central. It's the idea of tradition. For the Romans, it was the very source of traditional authority and politics. And if you drop memory out, you drop time out, you drop tradition out, you drop the past out, you drop so much of what, for Arendt, makes the human world human. And they do that because memory is fallible, and memory is hard to talk about true memory. What is a true memory? And so if you really want to talk about truth, uh, they limit it simply the mind, not to memory, but to intellect and will. And they frame the question is as a question between intellect and will, which is nobler and which has primacy. So just to understand the difference between the thinkers in chapter 2 and now the thinkers in chapter 3. In chapter 2, we're really interested in the inner life of man, the conflict, right? What's going on? My will, my memory, my intellect. How do I understand them? The conflict of freedom, sin. It's an inner life, right? For Aquinas and for Duns Scotus, that all drops out, right? It's really a question of primacy, and thus a question of truth. Which leads to truth? Is it the intellect and reason, or is it will and appetite? Now, Aquinas, basically says that the difference is between a truth that compels and a will that commands. So the truth tells us what is necessary, and the will simply commands us to pursue what the intellect compels us to know is right. He begins with this logical and rational foundation, which he describes on page 299 forward, that equates the true or the good with being, right? And since goodness is being, she says, for Aquinas, since goodness is being, evil is the absence of being. Thus, all created beings, which we're ens creatum, created beings, all created beings aspire to be true. Okay, but the intellect is what knows what is true, and the will desires that we become true, and thus the will serves the intellect, and the intellect is primary, and the will is simply an executive function. Um, and thus the answer to which is nobler or higher is the intellect. And so on 301, she writes, since the intellect aims at a universal being and truth, so the will is appetitive of universal good. It seems, she says, that they're sort of the same. But for Thomas on 302, he says, no, every will is preceded by an intellectual apprehension of the good. We need to know what to will. And that's the core Thomistic insight, right? That we need to know what to will, and the true reason that Thomas elevates the intellect over will, Arendt says, is that he believes that the highest happiness of man is to know God. The important word there is know. It's to know God. And this is going to be distinguished both from Augustine in the past and Duns Scotus, who comes right after him, because for Augustine and Duns Scotus, the truest and highest end of man's and man's happiness is not to know God, but to love God. For Augustine, this is the unio mystico, right, of man and God. For Duns Scotus, it's for different reasons, right? It's because we can't know God because he's a Franciscan. He doesn't believe that we have the capacity to know God, and so all we can do is repeat the Augustinian formula: amo volu ut sis, right? I love, I want you to be. Um, and and since we can't know God, all we can do is love the world he created, love existence. Um, and and for Augustine, that's an experiential uh, accept claim. For Duns Scotus, as we'll see, this transformation of willing into loving is a result of his embrace of finitude, right? That we simply cannot know God. And so all we can do is love what we have. I want you to be. So this brings us to section 12, Duns Scotus and the primacy of the will. I hazard to guess that many of you have not heard of or certainly have not read Duns Scotus. He's not a widely read or talked about figure in the history of philosophy unless you're in a very specialized world. Um, uh, Arendt says that that's a problem. She says that if she says that she wishes she were capable of going into him at length, but she's not. Meaning, let's just be honest. If she's not, I'm not. I don't claim to have any great knowledge of Duns Scotus's work. While I've tried to teach Aquinas at times and failed, I've never tried to teach Duns Scotus. Um, and uh, I'm simply gonna be able to tell you a little bit about him through what Arendt is able to say here. The importance of Duns Scotus for Arendt um, uh, is that he proves, instead of the primacy of the intellect, the primacy of the will, right? If for Thomas, the will is an executive organ of the intellect, for Duns Scotus, it's the opposite. The intellect serves the will by providing it with its objects and necessary knowledge. That's on page 306. Now, here's where I actually want to just do a little bit more on this distinction between Dominicans and Franciscans for you. If Thomas is a Dominican, Duns Scotus is a Franciscan. All right, what's the difference? Dominicans, like Thomas, argue that faith and reason are harmonious, right? That reason um, can lead us to certain truths about God, and that revolution and reason are not in conflict, right? So the basic position of uh, the Dominicans is a rationalist position. The world is rational. Reason, therefore, can decipher the world, and we can, in a sense, know God through human reason. In this sense, grace perfects nature. It doesn't destroy nature, right? Nature is rational. Grace is simply the universal reason that perfects nature and is thus in line with nature. And just as we humans can know nature, we can know grace and God's grace. Um, the Franciscan position, which is largely represented by Duns Scotus, but then has a flowering in the 19th and 20th centuries, um, uh, starting sort of with Kant, but really with Nietzsche and Heidegger, says that the primacy of it argues that reason cannot know grace, cannot know God, and thus for the primacy of revelation and will. The Franciscans emphasize um, will, love, and divine illumination over intellectual apprehension through reason. Um, Faith for the Franciscans is thus not rational. It's faith. It's super rational. Um, and while faith may, use reason instrumentally at times, um, no deep truths of faith can be given by grace alone or by philosophical inquiry. I'm sorry, they come by grace alone. They're not given by philosophical inquiry. What this means in the question of freedom is that freedom for the Dominicans um, uh, is not freedom to choose anything what you want, but simply the power to choose the good in accordance with reason. Whereas for Duns Scotus and the Franciscans, the will is precisely free in its ability to choose among contraries. In this sense, Arendt calls Duns Scotus the rare critical thinker on page 308. He's someone, she says, who seeks to prove what he suspects cannot be proved, right? Unlike St. Thomas and the Dominicans who know what they want to prove and then seek to prove it and think it's provable, Duns Scotus says, I probably can't tell you what being or truth is, but I'm going to try, and in trying, I'm going to come up with the limits. In that sense, there's a certain way in which we can read Kant as, in the history of philosophy, the fulcrum point between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, right? On the one hand, Kant has this idea of universal reason, and that there is a pure reason, and that there is also a practical reason that governs our moral and ethical world. And yet, on the other hand, Kant says we can never know it for sure, and thus we must, you know, there's a limit to what pure reason can tell us, and in practical reason, we have to, in a sense, simply take certain things on authority, and bow down to reason, which we can never articulate or know. And so uh, that critical philosophy of Kant's is one that I think she very much associates Duns Scotus with. She also associates here on page 309 Duns Scotus with Heidegger and the thinkers of finitude. The idea that, and this is a core thought of Heidegger's, right, which he largely, which he, unlike others, attributes to Duns Scotus, says that we are essentially limited creatures who cannot know the truth, and thus we have to live within those limits. Um, Okay, back to Duns Scotus and her articulation of his work. And the reason it's so important for her is that his question is, which he says on page 309, is what is it in the human mind that makes it capable of transcending its own limitations, its absolute finitude, right? So, on the one hand, the human mind has absolute finitude. It has limitations. It can't know God. It can't know the truth. It depends on grace. And yet, somehow the human mind can transcend those limitations. Does that mean the human mind can know God and know grace? No, because it can't know God and can't know grace. And yet, look, it transcends them and those limitations. Well, how? And her answer, and Scotus's answer, according to Arendt, is the will, right? Since no intellect or reason will give us the truth, according to Scotus, it must be the will. And what he argues is that since the key to understanding the will is that the will is free to reject reason. The will is free to reject reason. This is, of course, the um, core thought of human freedom, right? That I can will unfreedom. I can will to do wrong. And that is perfectly, I mean, Paul and Augustine knew that, right? I often do will not to do what I should will. I nil. But Aquinas wants to say, well, I have to, my will has to serve my intellect. And Scotus says no. It is in the power of our will to either will or nil, he says on page 311. We are free to will or nil either way. We can suspend our will and we can not will. Well, how does this will allow our human mind to transcend our limits and our finitude, right? Which was the question. Well, his fundamental thought is that contingency, the contingency of the world, is the gladly paid price for freedom, right? This is the sort of key idea here on page 314. We gladly pay the price of contingency, that the world is contingent, that we don't know what is necessary, and that there is no way that we can know what is rational or necessary, because it's what guarantees our freedom. To save freedom, we embrace will and contingency. And contingency is not just a negative, it's a positive mode of being. Well, in this embrace of contingency, our will, can transcend everything. It can even deny God. God created man to stand or to fall. And here's where she brings back the Augustinian formula, the Augustinian line, amu volu ut sis, I love, or to love, I want you to be. We can either want you or not want you. I can deny God. I can deny the world. And in this sense, man is to some degree free from God. I hesitate to say above God for a Christian thinker. Certainly Nietzsche will say that, but we're not yet there yet. But in a very Nietzschean sense, Duns Scotus believes that will is a power because it can achieve something. And Arendt writes this on 322, right? And insofar as will is a power, it has a potency. It is a mental faculty, unlike the intellect, which is simply a mental faculty. The will is a mental faculty with power. It can, right? So on page 322, she says, there is an I can inherent in every I will. And this I can sets limitations to the I will, which are not outside the willing activity itself, right? In every will, there has to be a potential to to be able to do it, a power, because it can achieve something. Um, and this is a transcendence. The will gives us this self-confidence to transcend um, simply being necessary and according to reason. Um, and Man is capable of transcending the world of being. She writes on 322. Man is capable of transcending the world of being with which together he was created, which remains his habitat until death. I mean, just think what she's saying. I mean, we can transcend the world of being. We can be more than what God made us. Um, uh, and 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 we can change the world. This is freedom. And Scotus turns this back to a Christian idea, insofar as he then turns willing into loving on page 323. Um, all in this idea of being free to love God or hate God, but we in the end seek to love God and thus affirm what is. Um, she ends the chapter with this discussion of Kant on 325 to 326, where Kant says that there's only absolute necessity in thought, not in the world. And this is a very this is something that Duns Scotus could have said, although for Duns Scotus it would also not be in thought. There's simply no absolute necessity. The will is primary, and this is what's so important for her about Duns Scotus. She really does think that Duns Scotus, in many ways, changes the trajectory of Western thinking and Western philosophy. She thinks he's not given the credit for it, that he's not understood fully. She says that Kant largely follows him, but maybe not even, she says, probably didn't even read him. And I take her word for that, although I have no idea. But she puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of Duns Scotus precisely because he moves the will, frees the will from the intellect, but frees the will also from the internal uh, life of the Christian man into something that has power in the world. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Um, uh, Happy to engage in your questions. I know these are difficult chapters, and I know that most of us have not read uh, either Aquinas or Duns Scotus. They're not people we tend to spend a lot of time engaging with. Um, but let's see if you guys have questions or thoughts. Jess, if you take a quick look at the chat, if there are any questions in the chat that you think I should address, that would be helpful.
I'm scrolling through. Thanks.
Okay, great. But we'll start with Anne. Anne, is that you? Whoops. Anne, did you disappear?
No, I'm here.
Ah,
Can you hear me?
yes, now I can.
Yeah. Actually, throughout the sections on willing, I've been struggling a little bit with the concept of evil. And particularly in this section where she starts off by suggesting that evil is in some sense something that has been deprived, like sight from a blind man,
Mm-hmm.
an absence of something.
Right.
And throughout, that idea seems to be carried on in the sense that the dominant drive is to do good and evil is some kind of disturbance of that desire in human beings to do good.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about my own experience of where I've encountered something very like evil, and particularly in maybe our current political environment. The importance of understanding free will as not just a desire eventually to do good, but actually the freedom to be able to transgress. Would that be where she lands with Duns Scotus? That freedom is not transcendence in that positive sense, but the potential for transgression. Does that make sense? I'm just not clear
Yeah.
where
No, I think
she
that
lands
makes
with evil.
I think that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, um, so much of the um reason that she imagines that philosophers have avoided the question of will and the question of freedom, right, is because with freedom comes the possibility of evil, right? If you're free to will or nil, um, if you're free to will the good or will the bad or the evil, um, then that's bad. Philosophers have thought because we should be governed by reason. Uh, and so someone like Aquinas and even someone like Augustine wants to read evil as non-being, as something uh, not possible, not thinkable, um, and irrational. Um, Duns Scotus, right? That's in many ways the power of his work is exactly what you are talking about, which is that he um, insists that will is primary. Now, he's still, right, a Christian thinker, and he's still, even though he thinks the will is primary, um, he he largely still sees evil, as far as I understand it, um, as a kind of non-being, but he embraces contingency. He says the world could be otherwise. Um, uh, he rejects, she says, that the old cliche that all men will to be happy, right? Um, um, it could be that men will to have pain. I mean, this is a profound insight, but it's also one that, is wildly contemporary, right? I mean, so much of, I think, confusion among many um, political commentators in the last 50 or 60 years comes back to the old what's the matter with Kansas issue, right? Which is why do people vote not in their self-interest? Um, and, there's a lot of evidence that people sometimes don't always do what makes them happy. There's a certain joy in doing bad things, in doing things that are, as you said, transgressive, that may get us killed or may get us impoverished and yet we enjoy them. Um, there's a kind of masochism, uh, joy in pain that humans have. I'm not attributing this to Duns Scotus. I'm simply saying that Arendt herself is quite aware um, that freedom doesn't always lead to um, what's rational, reasonable, or good. Um, if you know her book, The Human Condition, which by the way we haven't read in this group in a while, so we'll have to come back to it pretty soon. Um, but if you know her book, The Human Condition, one of the more controversial um, arguments in that book is that greatness of action can only be measured by greatness, right? Action is one of the core chapters of the book, one of the core faculties of the human condition. Action can only be measured by greatness, and greatness, she says, is not something measurable by moral criteria, right? Um, there are plenty of horrifically great people in the world, people who do acts that change the world, that make the world pay attention to them and impact the world. She calls those great acts. Those people who are immoral will go down and be remembered in history as great actors, but they're immoral, right? Um, and so greatness for her transcends morality. Well, so does freedom, right? Freedom cannot be controlled by this claim that some thinkers make that we're only free to do what is rational or what is good. Um, and this um, uh, and it's and while Duns Scotus is not making this argument, um, his embrace of contingency and radical contingency, um, and the impossibility of the intellect to control the will, and in fact the opposite, the will has priority over the intellect, um, is what she thinks prefigures the separation of freedom and will from morality, which really only takes place in Nietzsche, right? That's the way she's telling the history of philosophy. Whether there's an actual causal line between Duns Scotus and Nietzsche is an interesting question, because Nietzsche is really influenced by Kant, and she says Kant never read Duns Scotus. Again, but the point is, Duns Scotus put this idea of radical contingency in the world. If it weren't for Duns Scotus, we would not have had the Franciscan Dominican debate, which was so central to all intellectual thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries. Um, Kant could not have been Kant if he hadn't been thinking about this debate. And so even if he never read Duns Scotus, he was influenced by it. And that's the story that she's telling here. Um, and so yes, you're absolutely right. Um, the kind of the priority of the will, and thus the elevation of human freedom, which begins in Duns Scotus and has its first steps in Kant, and then is really brought to a kind of new place in Kant and in Nietzsche and Heidegger, um, which is the ground on which Arendt stands, and in her own work is she's trying to now rethink freedom, right, and make freedom into an idea of a collective action, right, um, to change the world. Uh, this couldn't have happened with Duns Scotus, and that's the story she's telling, and that's why she's really interested in this whole book on willing. The next four chapters that we're going to read, or next four sections in chapter 4, right, are on Kant, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, and and they will draw this to a close, and we'll read those starting in September. Do you have a follow up, Ann? Because it was a good question. It's an important question, or is that
No, that's incredibly helpful.
okay?
I mean, I haven't read Duns Scotus, and
Neither have I. I mean, to be, I mean, this is one of those things where, you know, I've read a lot in philosophy, but no one reads everything, right? You can't, you have to admit, I haven't read him. I don't know if Arendt read him. I mean, I think she must have looked at him, but I don't think she read him closely. If you look at the quotations in the text, I mean, she rarely quotes him, right? She's quoting um this guy Bonanze and Walther and others, but she's
yeah.
not quoting him for the most part. Um, and these and I did my first book was on a German thinker named Leibniz, who was um not a scholastic, but was one of the people who sort of came out of it. And I had to read a little scholastic philosophy in order to understand where Leibniz came out of. Someone named Wolff, Christian Wolff. These people are very hard to read because they're so, you know, boringly logical without any writing in them, rhetoric in them. And we just don't accept the kind of logical kind of thinking they do. And so it's very hard to read them today. But uh, but but yes, given that, he's still quite important.
Mm.
Thank you, Anne. Hannah.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but then nobody was raising their hand, so I'll just briefly say this. The one thing on page 115 of the old edition, which is
All
what
right.
I have.
I don't have that in front of me, so
All
can
right,
you
I'll
tell
read
me
it. I'll read it. It's just at
what?
the beginning of the Aquinas where she says, no rhetoric, no kind of persuasion is ever used. The reader is compelled as only truth can compel. I mean, it's really not true, that one line, because I mean, I do teach rhetoric, and Aristotle in the rhetoric talks about two forms of persuasion, two forms of reasoning, dialectical argument and rhetorical argument, both of which use counter argument, which is what they're describing. And when you teach how to give a persuasive argument, one of the most persuasive ways you can do it is to address the counter argument, and then and it strengthens your own argument. So it is persuasion, in fact, what she is describing. An argument is persuasive. It's the core of persuasion. So I think it's kind of a little strange that she said that. I'm not sure why, but it's just compelled as only truth. You can only get at the truth by using those techniques, I would say. Um, so it's a little strange that
Yeah.
one for me. Just if you read the rhetoric, if and what Aristotle says, and then two, um, well, I would love it if you could recap the debate between the Franciscans and the whatever, because my mind was elsewhere. And I wanted you to recap that because I didn't get it, if you know what I'm talking about. And then third, I'm just really curious, like all of these Christian thinkers, the will is always discussed in terms of how uh, the Christian how there it's how man can be, or humankind can be good by doing good. But in the Old Testament or in Judaism, it seems like the will is always located in God, and it's always God's will that is the primary actor. It's like God's will is always highlighted, like in the Old Testament, versus these uh, Christians always thinking about. I mean, it seems like in Judaism, it's like you've got these 671, whatever 600, and how many is it? 600 and something laws to follow from the Torah. But it just seems like what I said, that the will is always located in God. versus in man almost, or in humankind, which of course I'm sure is not true, but I would love it if you could talk about that just a little bit. And then if you could recap the debate, because I missed it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah. For someone who wasn't going to raise their hand, you got a lot in there.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Um, you know, three questions. So the first on rhetoric. I mean, you're right that obviously there's a rhetoric of Aquinas, right? I mean, I don't think she means it in that sense. What she means is that all the arguments and counter arguments are given through authorities, right? So he doesn't make he doesn't say, um, should the law be applied in this situation? And then, start saying, well, let's talk about it and let's think about psychology or this or that. He says, Augustine says this, and the in
Yes,
Leviticus,
it's appeal to authority,
an
which is
appeal
one
to
form of
authority.
persuasion.
Yeah, okay, but so yeah, I mean, it's if you look at it from a teacher of rhetoric and from an
Yeah.
Aristotelian point of view of rhetoric, it's an appeal to authority. What she means is that it's not. She doesn't think that they're making
It's one source. That's it.
it's yeah. I mean, they're not making arguments that are trying to be critical in any shape or form.
Right.
Maybe rhetoric's the wrong word, but yes, I mean that's what she has in mind, and you're right. Of course, it is rhetorical in
Right.
some sense.
Right.
Uh, I hazard. I hope I'm not going to bore people if I start to do the Franciscan. I always, even when I do it, I'm like, no one cares about this. This is stuff that nobody talks about anymore.
It
Um,
was interesting.
on a most basic level, right? Um, uh, the debate emerged uh in the scholastic tradition, um, in competing monasteries, Dominican and Franciscan monasteries, uh, uh, along the lines of um, whether we could know God and know God's will. Um, and one side says no, right? God's will uh, is divine and can't be known by human reason, and we only can attain salvation through the grace of God, right? And the other side says, no, God is rational, and therefore, since we're rational, we should, in principle, and we indeed can attain uh, knowledge through reason,
Oh,
and
I
that
see.
reason will equate with the grace of God. um you know for freedom for the Dominicans who believe that that grace can be rational is therefore teleological, right? It has a telos, it has an end. um and uh and as a result, to be free is to act in accordance with reason. You can't act free and act outside of reason. And there's this whole history of Western philosophy, right? Which says that, freedom is not the same as liberty. Liberty is to do what you want. It's to be a libertine, and freedom is to act rationally, right? I'm sure if you've studied political philosophy or philosophy, you've come across many of these arguments. Um, uh, on the other side, there are those who say, no, freedom is not teleological. Freedom is unbound. We are finite. And the free will is precisely free in its ability to um, choose otherwise and even choose irrationally. This is often called volunteerism, right? So Hobbesianism. Um,
Ah.
Hobbes is a Franciscan, a modern Franciscan.
Oh, how
Uh,
interesting.
um, um, Someone like Leibniz is a Dominican, right? Insofar as he believes that in the end we always choose rationally. Um, Kant, as I said before, is this fascinating figure in this debate, insofar as he's someone who, in a sense, begins with Dominican presuppositions that there is a universal law and that there is a pure reason, but says that we humans can't know it, and as a result, uh, you know, uh, we all we can do is criticize, do a critical philosophy where we show the limits of what we can and can't know, and don't overstep those limits. Um, Nietzsche then says, all right, let's step over them and elevate the will to be over the intellect, right? That's sort of the way this history often goes.
Wow.
On your last question, which is I think the deepest question and the one I'm probably least qualified to give a good answer to, um, about the question of Judaism within this. I talked about this I think 1 or 2 weeks ago when we were talking about Paul, and I mentioned a book, or it's an essay, great essay by one of my teachers, David Dalbe, um, called "The Nails," right? And as I said, what Dalbe shows is that in because there are these 600 Jewish rules that have to be followed daily, and that Judaism is a religion of the book, right?
Right.
And of the laws. Um, will the problem of the will is less apparent because Paul, in his turn from Saul to Paul, right,
Yeah.
rejects the laws and rejects the book because he says that the laws are problematic because you can follow the laws on the surface but not follow them in spirit.
Uh-huh.
And so what he says is that Jewish morality is hypocritical
Mm.
because you can simply follow the laws but not actually be a good person. And so what Paul says is that for Christians, the laws are not in a book, they're in your heart. And as long as you act with the proper Christian spirit, um, you can you're a lawful good person. As I mentioned, then this idea of um, the Jews as the hypocritical people of the book became one of the main tropes of anti-Semitism um, throughout the Middle Ages, uh, and that's part of the um, source of the idea of Jewish, being um, tricky, or like a snake, seductive, right? That they could be hypocritical, they could follow the law on the surface, but not in their hearts. And it became one of the main tropes of anti-Semitism. Um, and so that's one thing I can say about it, but I don't know if I can say much more.
That's probably the most incredibly central and important thing you could say. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad it was helpful. Yeah, I talked about it, I think, a little more 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you were on then when we were doing the Paul chapter, so you can go back and listen if you'd like.
I will. Okay.
Great. Julie.
Hello? You
Hi,
hear
Julie.
me? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Hi. I am referring to a specific piece in the Duns Scotus chapter, and I'm following the Mary McCarthy edition, so I can't give you
Can you tell me where it is in the
it's
chapter?
about 5 pages in, and
And what's the paragraph
it
begin?
begins, men are part and parcel of this creation.
Just give me a second. Men are part and parcel of this creation. All right, well. All right, go on. I'm not finding it yet, but I'll look.
Okay, do you want me to give you another one? It follows on the paragraph, let us start with contingency as a price to be paid for freedom.
Oh, okay, I know where that is.
Okay.
That's the key. Um, yeah, okay. That's on
Oh,
that's on page 315. So is it before that or after that?
it's after that, the next paragraph following, men are part
Okay.
and parcel of this
Oh,
creation.
yeah, there it is. Okay, great. I got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so just going down to the middle of the paragraph, I'm just trying to sort of deconstruct this, because I think there's something in it that is essential to Hannah Arendt's philosophy, which I find illuminating. And it follows a little bit on what Hannah was saying about this idea of the Christians and being created in God's image. So it said he was created in God's image. Goes down a little further, it says the hallmark of this creature, obviously closer to God than any other, is by no means creativity. In that case, the creature would have been something like a mortal god. So therefore, Scotus, in her mind, did not follow up his notion of a freely designed goal of the will, even though he seems to have thought of such a contentless ability to design freely as true perfection. And then she goes on to give a quote that says, it's as though being, having come into existence, needed God's final judgment for its fulfillment. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, this next part is what caught my attention. She says, and this judgment was elicited also from the mortal that had been created in his likeness. I think if you almost put a question mark and an exclamation mark at the end of that last line, isn't this her saying this is a fault in his argument? That he's saying that man is not allowed to create because of the fact because of the fact that it's bringing him too close to God.
Okay. So
And
there's two aspects of Julie, it's a great question. So there's two aspects to this, right? One is, as this paragraph begins, men are part and parcel of this creation, right? God's creation, and all their natural capabilities, including their intellect, follow naturally the laws laid down by divine fiat. But man, in contradistinction to all other parts of creation, was not freely designed. He was created in God's image, and in God's image, he is someone who's closer to God than any other. But even then, his closeness to God doesn't mean that he's God, right? He's not yet what is called an ens creatum. I mean, he's an ens creatum. He's not a creative being. He's created, not creative or creating. And this is fundamental to all Christian theology, including Duns Scotus. If Duns Scotus were to say that man could create the world, or man created God, not only would it be heretical, he would be Nietzsche, right? I mean, to some degree. I mean, that's going to be the Nietzschean move. But he doesn't.
Would it be unreasonable to say that man did create God?
Well,
I mean,
for Nietzsche, no,
the idea of God
for
came out of man's
no.
consciousness.
Well, for Nietzsche, it would not be unreasonable. He says it. For Duns Scotus, it would be highly impossible.
It would be. I understand that
because
belief.
man is created by God. Duns Scotus takes that as a given. It's that you can't I don't think you can get out of that in a Christian theology. Where the second part, though, and this is where your question gets interesting, right, is that once man is created by God, even though he's not creative, right, he can't create a God, a new world, right? He is free, right? And this freedom is the mental capacity, he says here, to affirm or negate freely, uncoerced by either desire or reasoning. So even though we are created, we're free, and we can affirm or negate. It's not that we can't create God or the world, but we can affirm or negate him. And that's the price that he's willing to pay. We can reject God. Man can reject the world, become a nihilist. He can reject God. Um, and 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 that's the danger that, to go back to Anne's original question, the first question, right? The danger in freedom for Duns Scotus is that man can reject God. Um, uh, Duns Scotus wants to believe, right? Um, uh, that a good man, right, will affirm God. Um, but he has the freedom to do it either way. And what he says at the bottom of the page is, after footnote 73, it is the miracle of the human mind that by virtue of the will, it can transcend everything. And this is the sign of man's being created in God's image rather than the biblical notion according to which God has given him dominion over all the works of his hands. Such dominance would only make him the highest of all created things, right? If you just were made created and dominant, he would just be a created creature. But because he's free, he has the capacity to either hate God or love God, affirm God or negate God. And the highest manifestation of humanity is to love God. I love you. I want you to be. Not to want you to rule you, not to want you because I need you, but simply loving without desiring. And that's Duns Scotus's understanding of what it means to be a Christian in the truest sense. But, and this is where he differs from Aquinas and others, that only is possible if man can also will otherwise and is free. Not creative, but free.
Okay, then can I just ask something? Earlier we said, you said, I believe, that in your explanation that to love God was to know the will of God. And then will was divided up into apprehension, method, and desire. Would this, therefore, from what you've just said, mean that if we can love God, if we can understand the grace of God, and not being a Christian, I see this as sort of a love of a universality or something. If we imitate, if by becoming closer and understanding his will, we imitate his apprehension, method, and desire, then we're closer to a truth or the good. Is that what all of this says? Is that what Duns Scotus is essentially saying and Hannah Arendt is picking up?
No, I mean, I'm not sure what I said.
I'm afraid I'm afraid I'm not very clear.
I'm not sure what, you said. I said that to love God is to know God or something. I don't think I said that, or I don't know when I said that, in what context.
I think you were explaining what they thought, not what you particularly thought.
Well, I mean, which is the they? I mean,
The Duns Scotus.
I mean, to love God is a free choice for Duns Scotus, not necessitated. It's different from knowing God, right? So Aquinas says that the goal of life is to know God. Duns Scotus says that what makes us happy is not to know God, first of all, because we can't, but secondly, because that would take away human freedom. So what makes us happy is to know that we can either love God or hate God, and then choose to love God freely. For Duns Scotus.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. Nicole.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I have 3-point question about missing links in my view, and asking you if these links are made elsewhere at the end of the book or the beginning that I didn't reread for the reading room. But first, maybe is about this role of God and all this, what she says, the importance of God in this chapter, because also of the philosophers she's building on to make her the case. But how does the fact that we would be created by God articulate itself with the fact that we are born beings, which insist a lot in other books and notably in the human condition. So can we? That's why I never know what she thinks and what she reports others saying, and I wonder if this is because, and also this is puzzling to me because this is the book she wrote last. And I found so compelling and enriching stuff in what she wrote earlier that here she doesn't mention. So one point is this tension between are we created by God or are we born beings? The second is out of the first section we read today, the point she insists on authority, as you mentioned in your presentation as well. But then the link with her essay, What is Authority? She makes no critical comment about that, apart from saying that it's boring, or she said this as a state of fact, but she doesn't develop. So voilà, maybe you have nothing to say of why she doesn't develop, or if you miss some development there, or should I not miss any development because that's not the point of this book? And the third point is this contingency. You mentioned that contingency is seen as positive by Duns Scotus. I very much go with that as well. But again, and especially in the human condition, she insists on the fact that reality is this infinite improbability. So she really embraced contingency a lot. She does that also in her What is Freedom essay to some extent. And I always found this very interesting in my life of being a civil servant, because in policy text, we always speak of uncertainty as a negative thing. We think that we should trump, sorry for using the verb trump, uncertainty or reduce it to create certainty, then we will have the Graal. But uncertainty is nothing less than contingency. And we never use this word contingency in policymaking. So yeah, so these three nodes, natality versus creation, authority, without going into what she develops in the What is Authority, and then contingency versus freedom and cause.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. So on the question of natality, uh the point of I mean, we have to maybe step back and say, well, why is Arendt writing a whole book on willing, right?
mhm.
And as I tried to say in the beginning, and we talked a lot about it in the first 2 or 3 sessions on the book on willing. I can't remember if you were there for those. Um, uh, her interest in willing is because of the problem of freedom, right? She thinks that uh, in order to have freedom, you need to free yourself from necessity.
Yeah, but say that in What is Freedom, or
Yeah,
in thinking also. So
yeah. So she's in her essay, for example, in Between Past and Future on What is Freedom, right? She has 2 or 3 pages on the mistake of Western political philosophy to read freedom as freedom of the will, right? Um, and it's just 2 or 3 pages, and it's mostly on Rousseau and maybe Plato. I don't remember exactly, but you can, in a sense, read this whole couple 100 page book on unwilling as an attempt to deepen that reflection, um, and try and understand why Western political thinking has failed to think uh, freedom and will outside of um, free will and internal debates. And her argument is that non-Christian,
you think this book is made for showing why we think wrongly about freedom and will?
well, it's not the only reason, but I think it's one, right? And so the argument is non-Christian philosophers haven't dealt with will and freedom because they've been consumed with reason. Christian philosophers are the ones who started the debate about will and freedom, um, because they were worried about uh, our willful refusal to or inability to follow the law. And um, as a result, they developed this whole philosophical, theological literature on freedom and willing. And what she's doing is, on the one hand, simply telling the history of that development, but she's also doing the very Arendtian project, right, of trying to show that there were people in the tradition who undermined that tradition in a way that pre that set the that made it possible to um, develop more radical ideas of freedom that she wants to largely embrace. And the first of those really is, well, I mean, Augustine, in some sense, even though Augustine is caught up in the Christian need um, uh, um, to overcome the carnal will with the spiritual will, he still, for the first time, imagines will as a spring of action. That's the first Arendtian like foothold, right? The second is Duns Scotus, to say that what Duns Scotus does is not only see will as a foothold of a spring of action, but to insist that the will is radically contingent, and insisting that it's radically contingent, um, understand that we are simply born beings, right, who can um, reject reason and reject God, or move in different directions and start things anew. Now, Duns Scotus is still a Christian theologian, and as I was just saying, is still committed to the idea that in order to live a good life, we have to affirm God and affirm the world that God created. But we might not. As we read in further into Nietzsche and Heidegger, we'll get closer and closer to Arendt's own position on these questions. As for the question of what is authority, and she mentions it, I think, in these pages. I mean, again, what she says is that Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus cut out memory from Augustine's idea of the mental faculties and the mental and what it means to think. And she's like, that's crazy. Memory is essential to thinking. Um, uh, but Duns Scotus and Aquinas kick it out. It was going to come back in volume 3 on judgment, right? So if you think about the 3 volumes of the book, thinking is a 2-in-1 conversation. Willing is always geared towards the future. Judgment is a judgment about the past. Her argument is that they all go together, but so I have no doubt that if she had ever written the 3rd volume of the book, a big part of it would be bringing memory and the past back in. But she didn't do that here because she didn't finish the book.
And also link with what she has been writing earlier about all this issue.
Exactly. I mean, there's no doubt that if you want to understand where the book is going, there are essays to read, right? Crisis and Culture, her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, and others. There are many essays on judgment and memory and things that one could go to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. George.
Okay, I'll be fast. The thing that caught my interest when you were saying, because you said no one's talking about the difference between the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Well, in my business, we talk about it all the time.
Yeah, but George, you're like me. You're a little one-eyed Jack over there.
Yeah, but the thing is that what I wanted to say, just following on the last question from the last person who asked the question, is we don't talk about contingency, we speak about uncertainty. And when you speak about uncertainty, then you're not going into Gnosticism versus anti-Gnosticism, which is all this is about. We're going into prognostics. In my business, they say, Doctor, what's my prognosis? And when you're talking about prognostic, then you remember that there's such a thing as probability, which never is mentioned in any of this stuff. Pascal mentioned it.
Yeah.
This is one thing that's never mentioned in these speak is that or hopefully you can decrease uncertainty by using probability and degree of belief. And somehow that's missed in all this talking about God and anti-God and all that. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Pascal with his probable opinions. I mean, but what the whole, I mean, the whole point of, I mean, the interesting, point of the probable opinions in the Pensée, right, is that um they're designed to show that anything can be a probable opinion, and therefore, um, if you move down the road to contingency and probability, you pretty much open the door to chaos.
Well, not really, because that's where base comes in. That is the degree of belief, really. You can't know everything. Yes, base says contingency is there, no question about it. So you have total uncertainty. How do you lessen that? And then you go into degree of belief. Well, you go not only into argument, you also go into experimentalism.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, right, but this is a different discourse. But yes, I mean Pascal.
Same
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I have much, to say. You're right. Um, I mean, probable. So, you know, I mean, the word rational, right? Comes from ratio. Um, uh, Probability, proof comes from probability or provability, and probability. And insofar as that's the case, it once you enter the landscape of having to prove, um, you're into the world of probability and not truth. Um, and that's the problem. I mean, this actually goes back to um, who asked the question about um, rhetoric. Hannah, I think. Um, uh, Insofar, and one of the reasons I think Arendt wants to say there's not rhetoric here, again, in a way that I understand Hannah said is wrong, is that we're not talking about proofs because we're not talking about probabilities, we're talking about certainties.
Well,
It's
but you're not talking about proof. You're talking, here's the religious part of it. You're talking about the belief, but you're
Yeah.
talking about the degree of belief. How firmly do you believe in something?
Well, I
I
mean, I
believe in
don't think these
belief.
people think of it as degree. They think of it as true or untrue.
I know, but that doesn't mean that they're right.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm not saying they're right. I'm trying to understand what they're saying. I mean, right. I mean, this is, Arendt is trying to understand what these guys are saying and trying to show how what they said has impacted the history of our thought and meaningfully so. She's not saying she agrees with them. I mean, she certainly doesn't agree with Aquinas about almost anything. She certainly doesn't agree with Duns Scotus about most things. What she finds important about Duns Scotus is his um, elevation of the will over the intellect and his embrace of contingency. But that doesn't mean she agrees. I mean, she's not talking about these people because she agrees with all of them. but she finds, this is the way she reads. And there's a generosity to Arendt in her reading of people for the most part, which we could all learn from, right? Instead of reading to trash people, she reads for the most part to find what's meaningful, and she takes from them. She takes this way of reading from Heidegger, her teacher, and it's one I think we could all learn from. Okay, Vigdis.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that last point. And that's also, in a way, how I read this, to try to see what I find that Arendt takes from these texts and in her own understanding. And for that, on page 304, she writes that the transformation of will into love in Augustine, as well as in Duns Scotus, was at least partly inspired by a more radical separation of the will from appetites and desires, as well as by a different notion of man's last end and happiness. And to me, this reminds me of her Amor Mundi, her love of the world. And it's also in a way that the will from the appetites and desires. So it's not what you do for yourself, it's what you do for the world that is what Arendt is so into in her thinking. And it also reminds me of something Richard Bernstein wrote about Arendt and her thinking that also relates to some strands of Judaism. And he quotes, among other, Franz Rosenzweig and Emmanuel Levinas, when they reminded us that the good Lord did not create religion, he created the world. And Bernstein thinks of Arendt in the same way, that her faith, like that of so many Jews before her, is directed more to the creation than to the creator. So while these people she's quoting from here is thinking about the creator, she is thinking mostly about the creation. But I think the way this concept of love, I want you to be, fits very good into her concept of how the Amor Mundi and the love of the world, which we experience. Do you think that has any, or do you see anything meaningful in that way to see it?
So yes, I mean, there's no doubt that I want you to be is a lifelong preoccupation of Arendt. She first encounters it in reading Augustine with Heidegger, and Heidegger has a reading of it, which he expresses to her in certain letters, that she fundamentally rejects. And over the years, she keeps coming back to it, and makes it her own. It plays a big role at the end of the imperialism chapter of The Origins of Totalitarianism. It also plays an important role in her thinking about reconciliation. And so, yeah, I think amo volu ut sis is a central idea in much of her thought. In the book I have that will come out on friendship next year, there's a fair bit there's a long part on that. So, there's a good reason to buy the book. But so yes, I agree with you.
Thanks.
Let me let Gilbert just have a final word here, because we're out of time. But Gilbert, go ahead quickly, briefly.
Thank you very much. So my question, I would like to address it to Peggy, as he wrote a very interesting statement. So please, Peggy, I would like to hear more clarification based on the statement that you wrote in the chat, saying that so much hypocrisy apparent in those that claim piety. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know, is Peggy here, and can anyone see where her chat? I'm trying to look for where she wrote this. Peggy, are you here, and do you want to respond or not?
Can you respond?
I can't find the comment. Does
Oh,
anyone?
but that was it, basically. So
It was she wrote it at
just okay, just that those that claim the deepest religiosity are often the most the that's the cover for actions that don't accord with the beliefs that are as expressed in the religions.
Right.
Basically that.
I mean, I think that's you know, I mean,
Th-
we've
they-
seen this over and over again, right? I mean, I talked to Hannah about this earlier, you know, how this was that there's a certain common anti-Semitic trope that says that Jews are hypocritical because they follow the rules, but they don't actually follow the spirit of the law. So, you know, if you go to law school, you'll learn the difference between the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, right? I mean, I'm a lawyer, so that's sort of the background where I read this through. Um, the Jews were thought to be a letter of the law religion, and the Christians were being a spirit of the law religion. What's interesting about the David Daubé essay that I've mentioned a few times, The Nails, is that what he says is you can turn it around and say that anyone who follows all 600 and whatever laws on a regular basis, you know, even if some of the actual laws they're doing, they don't have their spirit in it, there must be a deep religious belief that makes somebody be that committed to all those laws on a daily basis. Um, Whereas what Dalbe says is, you know, if you just say that all that matters is what's in your heart, you know, you can be quite deceptive and hide what's in your heart. So he sort of turns it
yeah.
around. But yes, I think it's fairly clear that both in religion and also in being a good citizen, many people are hypocrites. What Arendt says about that, of course, is hypocrisy isn't always bad. You know, hypocrisy is the compliment vice pays to virtue. It's still a compliment to virtue. Most of us are vicious or have vices. We wouldn't want to live purely according to our vices. And so it's good that we, at least to some degree, um, feel the need to be hypocritical and try and live according to certain virtues, even when they are somewhat maybe fake.
Hey, can I say something else?
Quickly.
Oh my goodness. That the you can see the members of Trump's cabinet wearing huge crosses, for example, and doing. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, and doing dastardly deeds that are, you know, horrendously harmful. Um, and another idea I had was the example is those that, you know, proclaim this deep adherence to whatever religion and are the go to, you know, sort of proudly go to services, boastfully, and then they reject anyone who's not of their religion. So it's, you know, beyond the philosophical. This is
Mhm.
the real life, you know,
Yeah.
consequence of feeling superior in your, you know, your religious garb, I guess.
I think that's always very true in politics. So listen, thank you all. We're going on a small break for the next month of August. I think we come back on the first of, is it the 1st of September? No.
The 5th, I think.
5th of September. If it's the 5th, then we can't read all four. Are we reading all four sections of the last chapter in 1 week?
There's 13, 14, and 15.
All right, that's a lot. All right. So make sure you give yourself time to read it because you're not going to read it in one sitting. Um, And we will do that on the 5th, and then on the 12th, I guess we're starting on Revolution.
Wow.
So look forward to seeing you guys on the 5th. Have a great rest of the month of August. I hope you get some rest.
Roger, what was it? I can't find that book, Nails. Who's it by? How do you spell it?
David Daube. It's not a book, it's an essay. I have a PDF of it, and if you want, email me and I'll send it to you.
Okay.
All right. So enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you on September 5th. Thanks all very much.